Story 1: Stalked by a Predator. The trouble started with a simple act of kindness. Amy didn't think twice about it at the time. Henry was just a lonely old man, a regular at the community group meetings she attended every week. He wasn't particularly talkative, sitting mostly in the back of the room, his shoulders hunched, his head down. Henry rarely spoke unless prompted. And when he did, his words were laced with a quiet sorrow. His wife had passed away several years earlier, and he seemed adrift without her, lost in a world that had moved on while he stayed rooted in his grief. One evening, after the meeting ended and people were milling about, someone mentioned that Henry was having a hard time making ends meet. He didn't have family nearby, and his finances were tight. Amy felt a pang of sympathy. I can bake something for him, she thought. She was already cooking for her father that weekend. What was one more small gesture? The following Monday, she handed Henry a neatly wrapped cake as the meeting adjourned. He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with gratitude. And for the first time, she saw him smile. "You're too kind," he said, his voice trembling. "No one's ever done something like this for me." Amy felt good about it. She had brightened someone's day. And that was enough. Or so she thought. At first, Henry's behavior seemed harmless. After receiving the cake, he started waiting for her after meetings, standing by the door with a smile that seemed a little too eager. He would strike up conversations, asking how her day was or complimenting her baking. Amy thought little of it. He was lonely, and she didn't mind chatting with him. But soon, his presence began to feel unavoidable. Every meeting, he sought her out. If she was talking to someone else, he'd hover nearby, waiting for a moment to interrupt. At first, it was subtle, just a question here or a comment there. But gradually, it became more intrusive. Once, as Amy was leaving, Henry appeared beside her car. "Need help carrying anything?" he asked, his eyes darting toward her groceries. She declined politely, brushing off her discomfort. "It's nothing," she told herself. "He's just trying to be friendly." But when she saw his car parked near her house a week later, unease began to creep in. The first time Henry showed up outside her house, Amy dismissed it as coincidence. He waved at her from across the street, his car idling. When she approached to ask why he was there, he gave her a warm smile. "I was just out for a drive," he said. "Thought I'd stop by and say hello." Amy forced a smile, her discomfort growing. "Oh. Well. I'm busy right now," she said, retreating back inside. The visits became more frequent. At first, it was every few weeks, then every few days. Sometimes he brought small gifts, flowers he claimed were from his garden or little trinkets he thought she'd like. Amy tried to rationalize it. He was lonely, she told herself. It wasn't worth making a fuss over. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after he left. Then, he started appearing in other places, places he shouldn't have known she would be. One Saturday, Amy took her daughter to a soccer game. She was chatting with other parents on the sidelines when she felt eyes on her. Turning, she saw Henry sitting on a nearby bench, watching her intently. Her heart sank. He didn't have a child or grandchild in the game. Why was he there? "Fancy seeing you here," he said, approaching her during halftime. Amy's skin crawled. She forced a polite smile and made an excuse to leave, her heart pounding as she walked away. After that, Henry began showing up everywhere. At the grocery store. At her daughter's school events. Even at her workplace. Each time, he acted as though it were a coincidence. His disarming smile masking the growing sense of unease Amy felt. She tried to avoid him, changing her routine and driving different routes home. But no matter where she went, he seemed to find her. The tension came to a head at a charity event hosted by the community group. Amy had debated whether to attend, knowing Henry would likely be there. But she didn't want to let his behavior dictate her life. She arrived late, hoping to slip in unnoticed. But within minutes, she felt the familiar chill of being watched. Henry was there, standing near the refreshments table, his gaze fixed on her. As the evening wore on, he cornered her in a quieter part of the room. His demeanor was different, darker, more aggressive. "Why are you avoiding me?" he demanded. His voice low but filled with anger. Amy's breath caught in her throat. "I'm not avoiding you," she said, trying to stay calm. "Yes, you are," he snapped. "I've been nothing but kind to you. Why are you treating me like this?" His words sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could respond, one of the group leaders approached. Sensing the tension, they intervened, pulling Henry aside and warning him to back off. Amy left the event shaken, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel on the drive home. After the confrontation, Henry's behavior escalated further. He began parking outside her house for hours at a time, his car a constant reminder of his presence. Amy would peek through the curtains, her heart racing every time she saw him sitting there. Sometimes he'd wave, as if taunting her. Other times, he just stared. She tried to go about her life, but the fear was overwhelming. She stopped attending community meetings, avoiding public places altogether. Even at home, she didn't feel safe. Her friends tried to reassure her. "He's just lonely," they said. "He won't do anything." But Amy knew better. There was a darkness in Henry's eyes, a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. Desperate, Amy went to the police. She explained everything, how he followed her, showed up uninvited, and refused to leave her alone. But without direct threats or physical harm, there was little they could do. "He hasn't broken any laws," the officer said, "but we'll keep an eye on it." Amy left the station feeling defeated. She knew she couldn't keep living like this. Finally, she made the decision to move. She found a new house across town, keeping her plans secret from everyone except her closest friends. On moving day, she felt a mix of relief and fear, her heart racing as she packed the last of her belongings. For a while, life seemed to return to normal. The sightings stopped, and Amy began to relax in her new home. She changed her phone number, deleted her social media accounts, and took every precaution to stay off Henry's radar. But the fear never truly left her. Every time she saw an unfamiliar car parked on her street, her heart would race. Every knock at the door sent a jolt of panic through her. She lived with the lingering effects of his obsession, a constant reminder of how easily kindness could be twisted into something sinister. Looking back, Amy wishes she had acted sooner. "I ignored the signs," she says. "I kept telling myself he was harmless, that I was overreacting. But stalking isn't harmless. It's a violation, a theft of your sense of safety." Her experience left her with a sobering message: if someone's attention makes you feel unsafe, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts and take action. Your safety is worth more than their feelings. Have you ever dismissed someone's behavior as harmless when it made you uncomfortable? Story 2, Albert Fish, the Gray Man. Not all monsters wear their menace openly. Some blend into the fabric of society, their deeds hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. Albert Fish was one of those monsters. A man who looked every bit the frail, harmless grandfather, with his unassuming demeanor and polite manners. No one suspected the horrors lurking behind his kind smile. But beneath that mask lay one of the most depraved minds in history. Known as the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Gray Man, Fish was a predator who preyed on innocents. His crimes so grotesque they defy comprehension. His story is a descent into human darkness, where trust was a weapon and suffering was his obsession. By the time Albert Fish was caught, he had cemented his place among the most chilling figures in criminal history. But what makes a man like him? Was it his upbringing, his own pain twisted into something monstrous? Or was he born this way, a creature of pure evil? Albert Fish's early years were marked by hardship and trauma. Born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. He was the youngest of 4 siblings. His father, Randall, was an elderly man, 75 years old at the time of Albert's birth. His mother, Ellen, was much younger but struggled to maintain stability in a family riddled with mental illness. The Fish family carried a heavy burden of hereditary insanity. Albert's uncle suffered from mania. One of his brothers was institutionalized, and his sister was diagnosed with a severe mental condition. Ellen herself experienced auditory and visual hallucinations. When Albert was just 5 years old, tragedy struck. Randall Fish died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving Ellen destitute and unable to care for her children. Albert was sent to St. John's Orphanage in Washington, a place that would shape the darkest corners of his psyche. The orphanage was a place of cruelty, where beatings were routine and fear was a constant companion. But unlike most children who suffered there, Albert began to associate pain with pleasure. The beatings, meant to break him, instead awakened something dark and insidious within him. When Ellen's financial situation improved, she removed Albert from the orphanage. But the damage was already done. At the age of 10, he had already begun his descent into depravity. As he grew older, Albert's fascination with pain only deepened. By his teenage years, he was engaging in acts of self-harm, including embedding needles into his skin, a practice he would carry into adulthood. He also developed an unhealthy interest in urination and defecation, behaviors he learned from a sadistic older boy. In 1890, Albert moved to New York City, where his descent into darkness accelerated. He began frequenting public bathhouses, not for bathing, but to watch young boys undress. He also answered personal ads in newspapers, sending obscene letters to women detailing his violent sexual fantasies. In 1898, Albert married Anna Hoffman, a woman 9 years his junior. They had 6 children together. And for a time, Albert appeared to lead a normal life. He worked as a house painter and provided for his family. But beneath the surface, his sadistic urges continued to grow. He often subjected himself to extreme acts of self-torture, including driving needles into his groin and abdomen. Years later, X-rays would reveal 29 needles lodged in his pelvic region. Despite his increasingly erratic behavior, Albert maintained the appearance of a devoted father. In 1917, Albert's fragile facade shattered and his wife left him for another man. She took most of their possessions, leaving Albert to care for their children alone. Her departure sent him spiraling into madness. He began experiencing auditory hallucinations, claiming that God was speaking to him and commanding him to commit acts of violence. Albert interpreted these voices as divine instructions, using them to justify his increasingly depraved behavior. By the 1920s, Albert was a full-fledged predator, preying on the most vulnerable members of society, children. He used his unassuming appearance and polite demeanor to gain the trust of families before abducting his victims. One of his earliest known crimes occurred in 1924, when he attempted to lure an 8-year-old girl named Beatrice Keel. He promised her money in exchange for helping him pick rhubarb. But her mother intervened just in time, chasing him off the property. Despite close calls like this, Albert's crimes escalated in both frequency and brutality. Albert Fish's most infamous crime began with a simple newspaper ad. 18-year-old Edward Budd had placed an advertisement seeking work on a farm. Fish, posing as Frank Howard, a kindly farmer from upstate New York, responded to the ad and visited the Budd family's Manhattan home. The Budds were impressed by the soft-spoken, elderly man. Fish seemed trustworthy, and his offer to hire Edward for farm work was a welcome opportunity for the struggling family. But during his visit, Fish's attention shifted to Grace Budd, Edward's 10-year-old sister. With her bright smile and trusting nature, Grace was everything Fish desired in a victim. He convinced the Budds to let him take Grace to a birthday party that afternoon, promising to return her home later. The family never saw Grace again. 6 years passed before the Budd family learned what had happened to Grace. One day, her mother received an anonymous letter in the mail. The contents were so grotesque that they defy belief. In the letter, Fish described how he had taken Grace to an abandoned house, killed her, and consumed her flesh over the course of several days. His descriptions were graphic and chilling, detailing how he had prepared and eaten parts of her body. The letter wasn't just a confession, it was a horrifying glimpse into Fish's mind. He wrote about his acts with a detached, almost casual tone, as though describing an ordinary meal. Investigators traced the letter back to Fish, using the stationery it was written on to identify him. When they arrested him, he confessed not only to Grace's murder but to several others, including that of Billy Gaffney, a 4-year-old boy who had disappeared years earlier. Albert Fish's trial in 1935 was a media sensation. His defense attorneys argued that he was insane, citing his lifelong history of mental illness and his grotesque practices, which included sadomasochism, cannibalism, and self-mutilation. Fish himself claimed that God had commanded him to kill, further supporting the insanity plea. But the jury was unconvinced. They found him guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to death by electrocution. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed at Sing Sing prison. Witnesses reported that he was eerily calm during the process, even helping the executioner adjust the straps. Albert Fish's crimes remain some of the most horrifying in history, not just for their brutality but for the calculated way he manipulated his victims and their families. His life raises haunting questions about the nature of evil. Was Fish a product of his environment, shaped by the abuse and neglect he suffered as a child? Or was he born with an innate darkness, destined to commit unspeakable acts no matter his circumstances? Perhaps the most chilling thought is this: if someone as monstrous as Albert Fish could hide behind the mask of an ordinary man, how many other predators walk among us, unnoticed? Could Albert Fish's crimes have been prevented if he had received help earlier in life? Do you believe his actions were the result of his upbringing, Or was he born with a predisposition for evil? How can society better protect vulnerable individuals from predators like fish? Story 3: The Ride That Almost Happened. The rain came down harder than she expected. It was relentless. A heavy, cold downpour that seeped through her jacket and chilled her to the bone. She cursed herself for not checking the forecast before leaving the house earlier in the evening. Now, halfway home, her umbrella forgotten on the kitchen counter, she was left trudging along the dimly lit streets, her hood barely offering any protection. The streets were eerily empty. The usual hum of life in the small town seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the rhythmic sound of raindrops hitting the pavement. Puddles reflected the weak glow of streetlights, creating a distorted, watery mirror of her solitary figure as she walked. She clutched her bag tighter, her fingers stiff from the cold. A glance at her phone told her it was nearly midnight. She scolded herself silently for staying out so late. It wasn't the first time she had made the mistake of walking home alone at night. But something about this evening felt different, heavier. She tried to focus on the sound of her footsteps, the splash of her shoes hitting puddles. Anything to distract her from the unease creeping into her chest. That's when she heard it, the low rumble of a car engine behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. It was just a car, moving slowly on the wet street. But as the seconds ticked by, the sound didn't fade. Instead, it grew louder, closer, until it matched her pace. She risked a glance over her shoulder. A dark sedan rolled up beside her, its headlights cutting through the rain. The passenger side window lowered with a faint mechanical hum, and the driver leaned over. "Hey there," he called out, his voice smooth and friendly, almost disarmingly so. "You look like you're freezing. Need a ride?" She hesitated, her steps faltering. The man appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, neatly dressed, with a trimmed beard and a wide smile. He looked like someone you might pass on the street without a second thought. Someone who blended in. She shook her head, forcing a polite smile. "No thank you. I'm fine." He didn't drive off. Instead, he kept the car moving slowly beside her, matching her pace. "Come on," he urged, his tone light but insistent. "You'll catch a cold out here. I don't mind helping you out." Her heart began to race, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Something about his persistence felt off, though she couldn't quite articulate it. She shook her head again, this time more firmly. "I'm good. Really. Thank you." The smile faded from his face. His tone shifted, dropping the friendly veneer. "You don't have to be stubborn," he said, his voice colder now, almost accusatory. "I'm just trying to be nice." Her instincts screamed at her to get away. She quickened her pace, her shoes splashing through puddles as she turned down a side street. The car hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to follow, before speeding off, tires spraying water onto the curb. For a moment, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Maybe he was just a pushy but harmless stranger. Maybe she was overreacting. But as she continued down the street, her sense of unease deepened. The rain seemed louder, the shadows darker. She glanced back several times, half expecting to see the car again, its headlights cutting through the downpour. By the time she reached her house, she was drenched and trembling. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers stiff and clumsy. Once inside, she locked the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. The warmth of the house did little to calm her. She replayed the encounter in her mind, dissecting every word, every look, every shift in tone. Was it all in her head? Or had she narrowly avoided something far worse than an awkward interaction? She didn't sleep well that night. A few days later, the memory of the encounter still lingered, though she tried to push it aside. She convinced herself it was nothing, just an unsettling moment she could forget. That changed when she turned on the evening news. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea, when the local anchor's voice caught her attention. "Police have arrested a man suspected of multiple assaults," he announced. "Authorities say the suspect targeted individuals walking alone during rainstorms, offering them rides before attacking them." Her breath caught in her throat as a mugshot appeared on the screen. It was him, the same man who had followed her that night, who had offered her a ride with a too-friendly smile that never reached his eyes. The room seemed to spin as the anchor detailed his methods. He would drive around on rainy nights, knowing people would be more likely to accept a ride to escape the cold and wet. Once they were in his car, he would lock the doors and take them to a secluded area. She felt sick. The tea in her stomach churned as the full weight of what she had narrowly avoided hit her. The realization changed her. Every time she walked home, she found herself hypervigilant. Her senses heightened to every sound, every shadow, every passing car. She started carrying her keys between her fingers, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, ready to call for help at the slightest hint of danger. The rain, once a comforting background noise, became a trigger for her anxiety. The sound of water hitting the pavement brought back the memory of his voice, the cold edge in his tone when she refused. She couldn't stop thinking about how close she had come. If she had been colder, more tired, less sure of her instincts, she might have gotten into that car. She might not have made it home. The thought haunted her. Over time, the fear began to fade, replaced by a resolute determination to never ignore her instincts again. She learned to trust that small voice inside her, the one that had urged her to keep walking despite the man's insistence. She also became more aware of the dangers that lurk in seemingly ordinary situations. Predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they wear friendly faces and offer help when you need it most. Her experience became a cautionary tale, one she shared with friends and family. She wanted them to understand that danger often hides in plain sight, that trusting your gut can mean the difference between life and death. The memory still lingers, a shadow in the back of her mind, but she uses it as a reminder to stay vigilant, to stay prepared. Would you have gotten into that car? Have you ever ignored a gut feeling, only to regret it later? How can we better prepare ourselves to recognize and avoid potential dangers? Sometimes, the most terrifying horrors are not the ones hiding in the dark, but the ones we invite into our lives unknowingly. Tonight's stories have shown us just how close danger can get, whether it's a neighbor you trust, a stranger offering kindness, or even a simple decision made in a fleeting moment. But what if I told you, there are even darker secrets waiting to be revealed? Did the footsteps in the woods belong to something more than just a person? Did the man by the roadside really have a harmless intention? And most chillingly, are there stories even darker than Albert Fish waiting to be told? If these tales kept you on the edge of your seat, you won't want to miss what's coming next. At Wolf Tells, we go deeper into the shadows, uncovering the terrifying truths behind the stories people dare not speak of. Before you go, don't forget, if you enjoyed tonight's chills, hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves a good scare. It helps our pack grow and keeps these spine-tingling stories coming. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Wolf Tells and turn on notifications, so you'll be the first to know when the next shadowy tale unfolds. Together, we'll continue to explore the unknown, one story at a time. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching the shadows.